Breaking news, breaking news, breaking news. P. Diddy gets slammed for calling the prosecution charges racist. Sit back, listen to it, how it play out. They go through the history of the white slavery charges so you understand exactly what's going on. This is a you don't want to miss program. Make sure you subscribe to my daughter's YouTube channel at Juanita Mecca Audio. Let's keep it moving. All right. You know what it is, Unique Mecca Audio, man. This one right here is about the Fed slam P. Diddy for calling the prosecution charges racist. This is Jesse Weber, Law and Crime, breaking it down. You really need to hear this. They got documents and everything to support what we're doing. Let's get this thing moving. All right.
There's a big issue to talk about when it comes to Sean Diddy Combs' upcoming criminal trial, currently scheduled for May 5th, 2025. The question is, will the jury hear all three charges against him? Will the court throw out one of his charges, a charge that carries up to 10 years in federal prison? Why do I say that? Because the government has just responded to Combs' motion to toss out count 3 in the indictment, because essentially Combs has argued that it is built out of racism. Yes, that is an argument that is being put forward.
So y'all put in the comments, do y'all think before you hear this program, y'all gonna be the jury right now? Do y'all think before you hear this program that these charges could be built out of racism, or you think Diddy's just grabbing straws? Put it in the comments.
And before I even get into the government's recent response to this, and I'll give you my opinion at the end about how I think this is all going to shake up, I have to briefly take you back to what Combs argued in a motion from last month. So the main gist is that Combs is being selectively prosecuted because of his race. That's the argument put forward by he and his defense counsel. That what makes this case so, as they say, unprecedented is that, quote, no white person has ever been the target of a remotely similar prosecution. And really, the focus is on count 3 in the indictment, transportation to engage in prostitution. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to actually read you what this charge is from the superseding indictment in this case. It reads,
this is what this charge is. Pay attention to it and read along on the screen, but we're going to walk through this as a jury right now.
From at least in or about 2009 up into and including in or about 2024 in the Southern District of New York and elsewhere, Sean Combs knowingly transported individuals in interstate and foreign commerce with intent that the individuals engage in prostitution, and attempted, aided, and abetted, and willfully caused the same, to wit, Combs transported, aided, and abetted, and willfully caused the transportation of female victims and commercial sex workers in interstate and foreign commerce on multiple occasions.
All right, so let me ask you this. So could they charge the Uber driver that takes a escort or a prostitute or a stripper after they raid the club and say they was in there stripping? Could they charge that driver or that transporter with prostitution with this same charge that they charging Diddy? Because that's what they're saying. He transported an Uber transport you. Let's see how this play out. Not picking sides, just picking fun so y'all can see how crazy these charges is. And this is what they got a billionaire and one of our first black, hip-hop billionaires, locked up for. Pay attention.
With the intent that they engage in prostitution. Now, Sean Combs argues that these allegations, the ones that I just read you, have never been brought before under this specific statute, namely the Mann Act, or what it used to be referred to as the White Slave Traffic Act, which, as Combs describes in his motion, has a, quote, very troubling history as a statute with racist origins, that it was used to target black men and supposedly protect white women from them. That's a quote from Sean Combs' previous filing.
But that's a statement from out of the case law when this first came out that Sean Combs filed in his motion that I noticed Jesse Weber skipped over telling you that these is quotes that he's using from the first white slavery crimes that they use, and they're using white slavery crimes now from back in the 20s all the way up here in 2025 on Diddy, 100 years later, to bring Diddy down. Listen to this.
Combs explores that in his filing, explaining that the specific statute that makes up count 3 in his indictment, it was enacted by Congress in 1910. And that, quote, the statute was born out of hysteria that white slavers were preying upon young women, coercing them into prostitution through threats, intimidation, and force.
Now, that's exactly what Diddy's charged for in 2025. We talking about a 115-year-old charge they went to go get P. Diddy on. And they said they got all these sex tapes, and there's no sex tapes, you know, except for the one that Cassie turned over with her and Puffy having what they themselves labeled as freak-offs, because it was just the 3 of them with a male sex worker that she chose, a location she set up, and then she called Diddy and said, yo, I got the freak-off all set up. All this is coming directly from out the court documents, so you rat bastards that want to look for something to nitpick and say Unique is defending Diddy. No, I'm not defending Diddy. If Diddy's guilty, he should get sentenced the same as I did when I was guilty and violated the law. But we know that the same way I had a right to be presumed innocent until a jury of my peer is the same way Diddy and anyone else do as well. Let's finish this. Remember, this is a 1910 law.
Combs continues, the statute's target was black male sexuality. And from Jack Johnson to Chuck Berry, the statute's most notorious prosecutions targeted famous black men accused of deviant sexual behavior. This case continues the trend. So he starts by arguing that the charging decision in this case by prosecutors shows an improper bias, that there was a discriminatory effect and a discriminatory purpose. Keep those two in mind. We're going to talk a lot about it in a minute, a little bit later. And he argues that the use of escorts, that's common in America today, and that the actual service at issue in this case is a legitimate business. And although the name is redacted in his filing, he says this is widely known, it is widely popularized, this service. And he points out, by the way, that neither that service nor its CEO, nor the escorts have ever been targeted by federal prosecutors in the Southern District before. They're not being criminally charged. And yet, he argues, no other person, including no white person, has ever been prosecuted under this act for hiring male escorts from another state. But
could that be racist, being that no other white person was ever charged under this statute? It's always famous black men that was trying to bring down. Pay attention to what's happening in 2025, y'all. Don't sleep. And you know the old saying, you sleep, you weak. Don't wake up crying in the morning when they wind up picking you up, saying that you flew a girl you met in Cancun up to New York City to hang out for the weekend, and y'all had, you know, a good time, and she go back, and then now she filed charges saying that you transported her and sexually assaulted her. Pay attention.
He claims he is the one who has been singled out, a very successful and powerful black man. Again, selective prosecution. And then he argues, look at other cases. Look at other high-profile white men who have or allegedly have engaged in similar conduct. And he cites former New York Governor Eliot Spitzer, who ultimately wasn't charged for allegedly being involved in an international prostitution service.
Whatever happened to Eliot Spitzer? Somebody put it in the comments. Pay attention now. This is deep. This is Diddy going at him now. And remember, his black lawyer wound up quitting, said that under no circumstances he could work with him. Maybe it was because they was pulling this card. Or was it?
So Combs' lawyers argue this is all circumstantial evidence of discrimination. And to further prove that, they argue the way prosecutors have handled this case shows a bias, that they have gone out of their way to humiliate Sean Combs, to prejudice a future jury pool with their pretrial publicity of the case. We're going to talk a lot about that a little bit later on too. So in the end, they argue either count 3 should be dismissed entirely, or in the alternative, they're asking the court that they order discovery regarding the government's charging decisions, meaning allow us to investigate why and how the government decided to bring this charge or these charges. Quote, to obtain discovery on a selective prosecution, a defendant need only produce some evidence of discriminatory effect and intent. In other words, a defendant will satisfy that preliminary burden by adducing, quote, some evidence that similarly situated defendants of other races could have been prosecuted, but were not. And that standard is easily met here. So that is the defense's argument. Throw out count 3, or at least allow us to investigate it about why it was brought, because there might be some racial undertones.
Do you think that was a bad request, or a desperate request, or just a simple request by P. Diddy? But before we go any further, Ron, now we're going to talk about that later. Let's finish riding.
By the way, little sidebar here, imagine this.
All right, so now, check it out. So this is where we at. We got a thing called Cashbox that we getting ready to come out with. I don't even really push the Cash App no more because I've been getting ripped off. I'm going to keep it 100. You know, they duplicated my account. Contact Cash App. Cash App didn't do nothing about it. So I contact my man. My man said, don't worry about it. What we'll do, we'll just start our own. So we started our own with what they call a virtual vault in the middle. So when someone sends money to you, it alerts you when that person goes to pick up the money. And then you look at your alert and you verify if that's the right person and that's the right amount. And then you release the money. But the money is not released in their account until that virtual vault alerts you that the money is being accepted by who you sent it to. So that's where we at. Don't say I didn't tell you. We don't need to hear all this old extraterrestrial talking about we fighting and beefing because we sent the money and the money didn't get there, because now we know with Cashbox. All right?
Offering no more than his say-so, the defendant makes the outrageous and illogical claim that federal prosecutors brought one, and only one, of the 3 charges against him on account of his race. Tellingly, the motion fails to mention that the other counts of the very same indictment allege that the defendant engaged in horrific and repeated acts of violence and sexual coercion, harming multiple victims over the course of multiple years. That context alone defeats the motion. And the prosecutors argue that race didn't play a factor into the charges that Combs faced, but rather he's facing these charges because of his, quote, own violent, abusive, and criminal conduct. And what is that conduct? Let's get a little more specific here, because what makes up the racketeering conspiracy charge, the sex trafficking charge, the prostitution charge? Well, the allegation is that Combs engaged in a pattern of abusing women, verbally, emotionally, physically, sexually, for years. And that included transporting women and commercial sex workers and coercing and forcing women to participate in sex acts for his own desire, that he would use drugs or threats or power to get them to do this, to get them to do what he wanted. And how did he carry all this out? Allegedly using his power, his resources, his business empire to carry all of this out, and his practices are violations of federal laws. So in other words, the government here explains that count 3, the count at issue, that transporting of people for purposes of prostitution, is exactly what makes up the core of this case. Quote, the indictment thus makes clear that the transportation alleged in count 3 served the defendant's abuse of victims. That count alleges that the defendant transported the same victims identified in earlier paragraphs as victims of abuse. That count also alleges that the defendant transported commercial sex workers, which corresponds to the allegations in earlier paragraphs that the defendant coerced female victims to engage in sexual activity with male commercial sex workers. All 3 counts of the indictment, thus, on their face, charge a common course of conduct arising out of the defendant's abuse and sexual exploitation of multiple victims. Okay, so they're saying it's all connected here. So what does the law say about all this? Well, as the government explains, a defendant who is challenging the government's decision to prosecute, so not challenging the charges, but challenging the motive behind deciding to charge a defendant. In order to challenge that, the defendant bears a very heavy burden. And that's because prosecutors, quote, retain broad discretion to enforce the nation's criminal laws. And they cite case law in support of this. Now, I have to clear something up here. Selective prosecution is not a criminal defense. In other words, Combs' attorneys can't argue in front of a jury in May that prosecutors brought this case because they're racist and therefore he should be found not guilty. It doesn't work that way. Arguing the prosecution hasn't met their burden of proof or that everything was consensual, those are defenses. Not this. But as a separate matter, as a way to get the charge potentially thrown out, you can argue selective prosecution. But as you can see, as I'm mentioning, it is not easy. What do you have to prove as a defendant in order to claim selective prosecution? Well, as the government lays out, quote, to establish a claim of selective prosecution, A defendant must present clear evidence that the decision to prosecute not only, one, had a discriminatory effect, but was also, two, motivated by a discriminatory purpose. It's like what we mentioned before in Combs' motion. Effect, purpose, and we're going to get a lot into that. So the government argues that Combs' motion fails to meet either prong, and we're going to break down why they say each prong doesn't work. But I thought this part was interesting before we even get into the prongs here. The prosecution writes, the defendant spills much ink detailing the origins of the statute charged in count 3, but he cites no law indicating that the legislative history of a statute has any bearing on either prong of a selective prosecution claim, and he makes no attempt to connect that history to the applicable test. Basically, they're saying all that stuff about the history of this law and all that, it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant to the analysis. So it made me wonder, are the prosecutors suggesting, yeah, you got a point. The law does have a troubling history, but doesn't matter. Doesn't matter in terms of the analysis. So let's talk about the analysis. Let's talk about what a court's going to consider or potentially consider. Again, two-prong test to show selective prosecution. The first prong, discriminatory effect. So to prove discriminatory effect, a defendant has to establish that others in a similar situation to Sean Combs have been treated differently, like they weren't prosecuted and that Combs was, that he was singled out. And the prosecutors first address Combs citing other situations, like the Elliot Spitzer case that I mentioned before. Or, Combs mentions this as well, how clients of that escort service that he may or may not have used, the one that's at issue, that they weren't charged under the Mann Act.
Okay, because that's the same thing like Hugh Hefner wasn't charged. Why they never charge Hugh Hefner? That's the main one. Hugh Hefner did the same thing that Diddy's doing right now, minus all that other stuff that the prosecution allowed you to believe that was happening, because we didn't hear about any sexual violence, nothing with no kids. All of this crazy stuff, the rape, none of that didn't come up. You know what I mean? Just this sex tape that, you know, he has to deal with, but with that sex tape, it shows Cassie enjoying herself and calling the shots. I mean, I'm not picking sides. I'm just calling a spade a spade. I mean, but this is just how stupid it is. And now they're going down the road as far as saying that you're charging me on the racist statute. You only charging me because I'm black. You put this in place because the black men back in the days when they first started getting power, white women was going to them, and you were scared that, like Jack Johnson took the white girl across state lines, so they charged him with white slavery because he took a white woman across state line. But why is it called white slavery instead of just, slavery? Huh? Because if you took a white woman, are they considering Cassie as a white woman? Or it don't matter in 2025. I don't know. Let's get back to Jesse.
And then also, Sean Combs referenced this, the scandal surrounding Jerry Falwell Jr., who allegedly had another man have sex with his wife as he watched. And again, those are similar allegations that are made about Combs, that he brought people into his sexual relationships and all that.
So did they charge him? That's what the question is.
So Combs cites that one for the idea that couples sometimes have a third party join them, and that's not a crime. That's not a crime that's been prosecuted. So prosecutors looked at all that and they say, none of these people are in the same situation or facing the same kind of allegations as Sean Combs. They don't have the same kind of aggravating factors like in Sean Combs' criminal case. So first, prosecutors explain how Combs is accused of sex trafficking multiple victims through force, fraud, and or coercion, and coercing them into commercial sex acts, including with male escorts.
Well, where's the force? That's all I want to know. Somebody tell me where the force is. I mean, because the lawyers don't see it. The lawyers wasn't giving it. We wasn't seeing it, but we seen it all on social media where everybody ran with the image that the prosecution put out of what took place.
That's why he's accused of violating the Mann Act. This is not like any of those other incidents cited by Combs. Second, they argue Combs carried out the transportation of victims by using force, fraud, and or coercion in order to cause those victims to engage in commercial sex acts, and that this was all part of a larger, broader pattern of racketeering activity.
So who else is involved other than Diddy and Cassie?
In other words, the Mann Act, or the White Slavery Trafficking Act that Combs has an issue with, count 3, the one he wants to throw out, that charge stands together with other underlying crimes to make up the specific racketeering charge that he faces, racketeering conspiracy. And racketeering conspiracy, what Combs is facing, is that there was an agreement to further a criminal enterprise. And prosecutors argue here that the transporting to engage in prostitution, count 3, stands together with other underlying crimes of the criminal enterprise, like arson, narcotics distribution, bribery, obstruction. It's all part of the same thing. There's a connection here. And that this alleged conduct overlaps, and in the same way Combs used his power and his resources to allegedly build an illegal criminal empire, he also allegedly used his power and resources to fund transporting people for purposes of prostitution. That's the allegation. And all of that to say this, quote, nothing in the motion, nothing in Sean Combs' motion, suggests that Spitzer, Falwell, or the other clients of the escort services transported escorts as part of a pattern of racketeering activity, or that they committed any other crimes whatsoever during the same period when they engaged in commercial sex. That distinction further widens the already vast distance between the defendant's conduct and the examples he raises in his motion.
Yo, so they saying that that the other victims didn't transport anyone. So Diddy's in trouble for transporting females and sex workers on his private jet or paying for them to ride first class. He violated the Transportation Act. So then how did these people get here? For Spitzer and the other people, he never paid for Uber, a New York City yellow cab. I'm just saying, let's get this moving.
Third, prosecutors argue that Sean Combs is ignoring that he allegedly violated the Mann Act, not just by transporting escorts, it's not that simple, but also transporting victims of sex trafficking. So therefore, you can't really cite other people who just simply paid escorts. This is very different. Quote, examples of other individuals who may have paid escorts but were not involved in the transportation of victims of trafficking are thus inapt. Fourth, they argue Combs doesn't show that those other people he mentioned, they would have even met the elements of the Mann Act to be charged. That Combs doesn't cite any evidence that Spitzer, Falwell, or the other clients of that escort service transported anyone across state lines for purposes of commercial sex. And there's no indication that Falwell even paid anyone to engage in sex acts.
Well, you know what this sounds like? And don't be surprised if this judge do it, because the judge has been a really fair judge on both sides. Don't be surprised if they call an evidentiary hearing for this, because the prosecution is saying he didn't argue this, he didn't argue that. He's not saying that he's wrong. He's just saying he didn't argue that. He didn't show how Spitzer transported people. He didn't show how it was multiple this. He didn't show that. So that is when they call for an evidentiary hearing, where they come in and they bring their evidence together, and then the judge hear the evidence, and then he make a decision on the motion. So don't be surprised if they call an evidentiary hearing on this issue right here, dealing with race, because Diddy have a strong claim, whether you rat bastards and flip-flop wearing in public, trolls won't admit it or not. And see the outfit I'm wearing? It's for my man Ock Joint. It's called Bigger Than Life. All right? This outfit is Bigger Than Life. You can find it at Bigger Than Life, life spelled with Lyfe. BIGGERTHANLYFE.com. This the Bigger Than Life gig. You know what I mean? The joint crazy fire. Alright.
Rather, the article that Combs cited in his motion about Jerry Falwell Jr., all that article simply suggests is that a third party consensually participated in sex acts with Falwell and his spouse. So in other words, this goes to a larger argument put forward by the prosecution that this case isn't about simply Sean Combs having group sex or inviting somebody in to have sex with a partner of his while he watched. It's much wider than that. So the government explains it best like this, that if Combs really wanted to make the proper comparison about somebody who was just like him and wasn't charged like he was, quote, far afield from the examples cited by the defendant, a similarly situated individual to the defendant would be somebody who engaged in violence and coercion as part of a pattern of racketeering activity and who transported not only escorts but also victims of that violence and coercion. Because the defendant's alleged criminal conduct is considerably more serious than anything he accuses these individuals of, he has failed to identify any similarly situated individuals who were not charged. This is fatal to his claim. And
none of them dudes was charged with the RICO and all of this. I mean, come on, dog. How many scandals have we seen throughout our lives with these sex scandals and all of this? And none of them get dragged into a federal court for RICO and their house raided and everything else. Come on, dog.
Also, prosecutors point out that Combs doesn't even argue that the entire indictment is improper selective prosecution, but only count 3. Wouldn't he have to show someone who was charged with racketeering conspiracy and sex trafficking but wasn't charged with the Mann Act to make a proper comparison? It's a fair argument, and yet he doesn't. And the thing about that is the government argues that there are cases in the Southern District where this case is being heard, this very jurisdiction, where you have people of varying races who were charged with the Mann Act and sex trafficking, like wealthy fashion executive Peter Nygaard.
What about the RICO?
A white defendant who was charged in this district with racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking, and Mann Act violations.
What about the RICO?
Or what about Ghislaine Maxwell, right? The white Jeffrey Epstein accomplice charged with sex trafficking and Mann Act violations. And prosecutors cite other cases.
What about the RICO for her too? See, nobody gets the RICO but a black man. And they bypassing that. They think we can't see this.
From this district where someone is charged with both Mann Act and sex trafficking violations and using the Mann Act to prosecute those who are accused of sexual abuse.
This is the first time they charge anybody with a RICO for having sex. Just pay attention to that. So that's all they need to hammer on. No one has been charged. Well, drop the RICO and let's just go with these other charges. That's all they need to tell them. No one else got the RICO, and that's what this charge is about, selective prosecution. You selected to charge me with the RICO.
So in other words, this is all routine. It's not about Sean Combs' race. It's not about selective prosecution. It is routine where there are aggravating factors like prosecutors claim there are in Sean Combs' case.
So you tell me Jeffrey Epstein couldn't get a RICO charge when he had this girl going out picking up people, other people picking up people. That's the 5 or more people we know. We don't even know who Diddy's 5 or more people is.
They write, quote, contentions that a handful of individuals were not criminally charged out of the millions of individuals who reside in or otherwise subject to potential prosecution in the Southern District of New York are plainly inadequate to meet the requisite threshold to demonstrate discriminatory effect. And they cite a case that apparently held, quote, in the absence of evidence demonstrating how many individuals the Southern District of New York prosecutor knowingly failed to prosecute, we cannot say that the district court exceeded its allowable discretion in finding that the defendant did not present some evidence of having been singled out. So in other words, quote, the defendant fails to cite even a single case in which a court has ordered discovery on selective prosecution claims based on such tenuous allegations, and the government is aware of none. So, that was all the first prong, discriminatory effect. They say he doesn't meet it. Now we move on to prong 2, discriminatory purpose. So again, this is all to show that prosecutors engaged in selective prosecution against Combs. Okay, so what do we mean by discriminatory purpose? Well, as the government explains, quote, the second required prong is discriminatory purpose, meaning the defendant must have been selected for prosecution based on such impermissible considerations as race, religion, or the desire to prevent his exercise of constitutional rights, meaning the prosecution selected to prosecute Sean Combs in bad faith. And here, prosecutors argue that Combs has failed to meet this prong as well, that he can't establish any credible evidence that count 3 resulted from a discriminatory purpose.
Hold on. Let me give y'all an example. We're going to ride. We ain't take a ride all night. We're going to take a ride. Check it out, right? They had something back in the days, right, when we was moving them keys up and down the highway, right? On the turnpike, New Jersey Turnpike, they used to do something they call racial profiling. That's equivalent to in the same field as selective prosecution. They selecting you because of this and that. Now, racial profiling was, I'm driving down the street and I'm looking like this and I'm driving in a Mercedes-Benz in 1980, 1990, 1988, 90, 91, 92, before, this thing went to court. The police see you in a Mercedes-Benz dressed like a hip-hop person, dressed like a street person, and they automatically associate you as a drug dealer. They put you out the car, they put you on the ground, they handcuff you, they bring the dogs, they go do all that, and then they tell you, sorry, we didn't mean to stop you. And if you say, I'm going to sue you, then now they say that, you threatened them or you did whatever. But the whole thing was because of what they called racial profiling, because he's wearing a bucket hat, Versace glasses, and diamond chains. He's obviously got to be a drug dealer. And the police actually told the judge when they asked them, well, why did you pull Unique over? Oh, because he was wearing a bucket hat, Versace's, and chains and looked like a drug dealer. And he said, so you pulled him over because he looked like a drug dealer? And he said, yeah. They said, okay, but did you find any drugs? Yeah, okay, you found the drugs. But now, what was the reason? The reason was he looked like a drug dealer. I stopped and found the drug. They said, well, no, now we have to throw it out because you used the wrong probable cause to stop him. If it was a traffic violation, then you could stop him, and whatever you find, you could use. But if you violate the fruits of the labor, then everything gets thrown out. All right?
Or as they write, quote, while the defendant slings accusations of racism throughout his motion, he identifies no actual evidence, as opposed to mere assertions that he was prosecuted because of his race. Indeed, apart from speculation and conclusory assertions, the defendant cites no evidence to make that showing, nor could he, because race played absolutely no role in the decision to charge the defendant. And then the prosecutors continue by addressing Combs' argument that, hey, I have the proof of discriminatory purpose because look at the way the prosecution has gone out of its way to humiliate me, to publicize this case. Remember that argument that I mentioned before? So the allegation that they have tried to prejudice the jury pool with pretrial publicity that, quote, plays on racist tropes, the prosecutor said, if you're referring to when the former U.S. Attorney Damian Williams held a press conference upon the arrest and indictment of Sean Combs back in September, what racist tropes are you talking about? What did he do that was so wrong? They argue that that press conference was in compliance with local Southern District Rule 23.1. That governs against lawyers making any out-of-court statement that goes beyond the public record or is not necessary to inform the public. But take a listen to what Damian Williams had to say. This is a sample.
When Combs didn't get his way, he was violent, and he subjected victims to physical, emotional, and verbal abuse so that they would participate in the freak-offs, and that Combs hit, kicked, threw objects at, and dragged victims, at times by their hair. On one occasion in March of 2016, that conduct was captured on video and later reported in the media. Specifically, Combs kicked, dragged, and threw a vase at a victim in a Los Angeles hotel when the victim was attempting to flee.
And moreover, the prosecutors assert that that press conference and the accompanying press release by the Department of Justice, they are consistent with what they do in other cases. And they even cite the recent sex trafficking case of the White Alexander brothers, Alon, Tal, Orrin Alexander, who we have focused upon a lot here in Sidebar. And remember, Damian Williams spoke out at their press conference.
As alleged, the defendants used their wealth and positions to create and facilitate opportunities to sexually assault women. This conduct, as alleged, was heinous. I stood here several months ago and made clear that this office is firmly committed to prosecuting individuals who exploit and abuse women. I meant what I said. With our law enforcement partners, this office is determined to investigate and prosecute anyone who engages in sex trafficking, no matter how powerful or wealthy or famous you may be.
So the idea here, pretty similar to the Combs press conference, right? And from there, prosecutors address the other evidence that Combs says proves there was discriminatory purpose. For example, quote, the defendant complains that he was not permitted to surrender and was instead arrested by federal agents. This is about when he came to New York and he was ultimately arrested at his hotel. Quote, but the decision not to permit a defendant charged with committing violent crimes, engaging in obstruction, and sexually exploiting victims is entirely consistent with the practice of the U.S. Attorney's Office in other cases. And again, does not provide any basis to infer racial animus with respect to count 3. Or there's another argument that Sean Combs apparently brought up, how so much force was used when his LA and Miami properties were raided by federal agents back in March of 2024. Maybe that shows a racial animus. Well, the prosecutors respond by saying, quote, the defendant repeats his prior complaints about the manner in which search warrants were executed at his homes. That argument ignores that the warrants were executed not by the prosecutors in this case, but by law enforcement agents who are not the subject of selective prosecution claims. Setting aside that the use of force to secure a premises, especially when the crimes under investigation include violence and the items to be seized include firearms, is entirely justified, it certainly does not demonstrate discriminatory purpose when electing to charge count 3. So in the end, the prosecution argued, quote, the defendant has failed to adequately allege that there was anything unusual, let alone improper, about the charging decisions in his case. Because his allegations fall far short of the rigorous showing necessary to make out a prima facie case warranting the disclosure of discovery, much less the clear and convincing standard required for dismissal of count 3 for selective prosecution, his motion should be denied. For the reasons set forth above, the defendant's motion to dismiss count 3 should be denied. Now, my personal take, I think the government's going to win this. I do. I think that when you listen to what they have to say and you put forward this idea of such a difficult burden for the defense to overcome, to show selective prosecution, to me, it doesn't seem Combs was specific enough about how this was discriminatory, putting enough evidence to show that. I got to give him credit, though. Really interesting argument. Haven't seen this one before. We'll see which way the court goes. But again, my personal take, I think the government's going to win this one.
All right, so that's what it is. All right, so now y'all sit there, you put in the comments, you let me know. Make sure you go subscribe my daughter's YouTube channel at Juanita Mecca Audio, Unique Mecca Audio Prison Stories, and Mecca Audio TV, and cop my man's gear, Bigger Than Life, life spelled L-Y-F-E, Bigger Than Life, LYFE.com, and be on the lookout for Cashbox. We in the house. All right.
Out the can of 26, he back on the strip, getting back in the mix. What he mentions a gift. You stand up 10 toes down, and I suggest you pay attention to this. Take a little gully posse and put it in Harlem. He cut from the bottom, came up from the bottom. Drop the book, you should go and get it. The Instagram page and the YouTube, you could go and visit. Then you could consider yourself LinkedIn. Sit front row and get Jews from a kingpin. How he went through it, so you ain't gotta go do it. To not pay attention would be stupid. Talking about a man that probably put your grandfather on. Probably the reason that him and your grams got along. A man that generated millions on the block, did his time, never squilling to the cops, Mecca Audio. Get it live like 2 G's in the 90s. Drop top beamer so shiny. I let shorty go, she was whining. Treat her like my past, she behind me. Spin a couple bands on the Dapper Dan. You be back again, getting green like a Packers fan. No cap, it's a roaring uptown. They be horn uptown, Dominican bust downs. Now we on the positive, we got a lot to give. Now he trying to stop the kids from being inoperative. So take heed, homie, lend an ear. He started in uptown, he gon' finish dead. But now it ain't about selling drugs, buying cars. It's about buying property to make the community ours, so we can give back to the